I never thought I'd find myself alone in a house with my brother-in-law, especially not under those circumstances, and especially not with what he ended up saying. It still gives me chills when I think about it. It all started on a rainy Friday evening, the kind where the sky turns gray before dinner and the house feels just a little too quiet. My sister had asked me to stop by and check in while she was away for a short weekend trip. She had some last-minute work out of town, and her husband, Mark, was going to be home alone. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. We'd always gotten along well enough, and it wasn't like I hadn't visited them before. But this visit, this night, turned out to be different. I didn't notice anything strange at first. In fact, when I arrived, Mark greeted me at the door with his usual half-smile and a tired look in his eyes. He mentioned he'd been working late all week and was just trying to get through the weekend before things picked up again. I believed him. There was nothing in his voice or expression that gave me a reason not to. The house smelled faintly like coffee and laundry detergent, familiar and safe. We made small talk, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the hours passed, I started to sense something off. It was subtle, just the way he paused before answering certain questions or how he seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. We ended up sitting in the living room, the rain tapping steadily against the windows. He offered me tea, and we sat across from each other on the couch. It was quiet, and for a moment it felt peaceful until he broke the silence. What he said next is still burned into my memory. Not because it was loud or aggressive, but because of how calm, how matter-of-fact it was. His voice didn't shake. There was no nervousness in his eyes. Just certainty. At first, I thought he was joking. He had to be. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, and I knew this wasn't a joke. My stomach tightened, and suddenly, the cozy living room didn't feel so cozy anymore. The warmth from the tea in my hands disappeared, replaced by a cold knot in my chest. I wanted to respond, to say something, but my throat was dry. The words just wouldn't come. He leaned back like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just said something that made the air in the room shift. I tried to laugh it off, to keep things normal, but he just stared at me, waiting. That's when I realized this wasn't just an uncomfortable moment, it was a turning point. And I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. I could hear the creak of the old pipes in the walls and the ticking of the kitchen clock. The house, once filled with familiar sounds, now felt like it was holding its breath. My mind raced. Should I leave? Say something? Pretend I didn't hear what he just said? Every option felt risky, like choosing the wrong one might change everything. This wasn't how I thought the night would go. I came over to help, to keep him company, maybe even cook dinner together like we had before. But now, all I wanted was to figure out what was going on, and whether I was still safe in that house. I didn't know it yet, but that night was far from over. And what came next would change the way I saw him, and everything I thought I knew, forever. I sat there, frozen, still holding the warm mug like it might shield me from whatever was happening. Mark looked so casual, like he hadn't just said something completely out of line. He even gave a small shrug and leaned his head back against the cushion like we were just catching up on family gossip or talking about weekend plans. But what he'd said wasn't small talk, it was personal, weird, and out of nowhere. I replayed his words in my head again and again, trying to make sense of them, wondering if I had misunderstood, but no, there was no mishearing what he said. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like he'd been waiting for the right moment. Like maybe he'd thought about it before. That thought alone made me uncomfortable. My sister and I have always been close. We tell each other everything, or at least I thought we did. I would have never imagined anything odd going on between her and Mark. He always came across as respectful, quiet even. He wasn't the loud or flirty type. More the kind of guy who kept to himself at family gatherings, who brought the drinks and then stayed by the edge of the conversation. So why now? Why say something so strange when we were alone? I shifted in my seat and tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, hoping it would smooth over the weirdness. I asked about work, mentioned a new show I'd been watching, even joked about the rain making me feel like a shut-in. He played along for a bit, smiling politely, but his eyes were somewhere else. That far-off look crept back in, and I knew he was still holding something back. The living room lights flickered slightly with the storm, and for a second, I wondered if I should just excuse myself and leave. Say I had plans, pretend I forgot something important. But I didn't move. The thing is, part of me needed to understand what was going on. Curiosity has always gotten the better of me. I figured if I could just keep him talking, I'd get to the bottom of it. Maybe there was something else going on, maybe he was stressed, or dealing with something I didn't know about. After all, being married to my sister couldn't be the easiest job in the world. She's strong-willed, independent, always on the move. Their relationship seemed solid on the outside, but how much do we ever really know about what goes on behind closed doors? He finally got up and walked into the kitchen, and I heard the fridge door open and close. I stayed seated, thinking. There was an old photo on the shelf beside the TV, one from their wedding. The two of them looked so happy, so normal. Mark with his awkward smile and my sister beaming in her dress. I felt a twist in my stomach. Something didn't add up. When he came back, he didn't sit down. He stood a few feet away, holding a bottle of water, and looked at me differently this time. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was intense. Like he was waiting for a reaction, or maybe checking to see if I'd already made up my mind about him. He opened his mouth, like he was about to say something else, something more, but then the sound of thunder rolled through the house and he stopped. I glanced at my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I thought about texting my sister, just to say hi, to see how her trip was going, but something told me not to. Not yet. I had a feeling that whatever this was, whatever he was holding back, I was about to find out. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Mark finally sat down again, this time a little closer than before. Not too close to make it obvious, but just enough to feel it. I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust the cushion beneath me. The room felt heavier than it did earlier, like the air had thickened and every small sound echoed louder than it should. The rain outside had turned into a full-on storm, with the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I found myself glancing toward the front door more than once, making sure it was still unlocked. Just in case. He started talking again, but this time, it wasn't weird or uncomfortable, at least not right away. He told me about work, how things had been falling apart there, how the company might downsize. I could hear the frustration in his voice, how he felt useless and ignored. It was the most I'd ever heard him open up about anything. He mentioned how my sister had been distant lately, how she was always busy, how they barely talked anymore. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me being there. This was about something deeper, something building up inside him for a long time. But still, none of it explained what he said earlier. I listened carefully, nodding when it seemed right. I didn't want to set anything off. I could feel his emotions shifting. One second he was calm, the next he sounded bitter, like he was holding back anger. I kept wondering if this was how he talked to my sister when they fought. If she knew he felt this way. If she had any idea what he was carrying around. Then he said something strange. He mentioned a conversation he overheard between me and my sister a few months ago. Something personal. Something I didn't even think she'd tell him. But clearly, she had. Or maybe he was listening when he wasn't supposed to. My chest tightened. That meant he'd been paying attention in ways I hadn't noticed. Maybe even watching. I didn't like that thought at all. The living room suddenly felt smaller, the shadows in the corners darker. He wasn't angry at me, but he wasn't just confiding either. It was like he was trying to pull me into something, like he wanted me to see things from his side, to take his side. And that scared me more than anything else. Because if he was willing to open up like this now, what would happen if I didn't react the way he wanted? What if this was leading to something else entirely? And deep down, a part of me was starting to worry. What if this wasn't just about a bad marriage or a rough week at work? What if he'd planned this all along? The storm outside grew fiercer, and the wind rattled the old windows, but inside, the house had fallen into an unsettling silence. Mark hadn't stopped talking, but now his words felt like a slow unraveling thread, each one pulling us further into something I wasn't sure I could escape. He mentioned my sister again, how everything between them felt so off, and how he just couldn't figure out where things had gone wrong. He wasn't asking for advice anymore, though. It was like he was talking to himself, trying to make sense of something that had been eating at him for too long. But the more he spoke, the more his words seemed to take on a different tone, darker, heavier. At one point, he said something that made my heart skip a beat. He mentioned seeing me look at him differently a few weeks ago. The way I looked at him in the kitchen when I thought no one was around. My mind raced. Was he trying to accuse me of something? Had he misunderstood a simple glance? Or was he trying to twist the truth to fit whatever narrative he'd built in his mind? I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. My gut told me something wasn't right. There was too much weight in his voice, too much intent behind the way he said certain things. The way his eyes kept flickering to the door as if he was waiting for someone to come through it, someone who wasn't me. His next words stopped me in my tracks. You know, he said, leaning in just a little too close, you've always been my type. I wonder if your sister ever noticed. I froze, the blood in my veins turning cold. My mouth went dry. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was calculated, almost predatory. My stomach lurched, and I found myself backing away, but the couch corner stopped me. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't know how to respond. Didn't know what to say. The tension in the room thickened to a point where it felt suffocating. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, he said something I didn't expect at all. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. My pulse raced, and I could feel my breath catching in my throat. Mark's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. I couldn't think straight. What are you talking about? I forced the words out, my voice barely above a whisper. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the twisted web he was weaving. But before I could say anything more, a sudden noise from the hallway made me jump. The sound of footsteps. I froze. Mark didn't seem to notice. He was too focused on me, watching me closely, his eyes dark, intense. I glanced nervously toward the hallway. It wasn't my sister, she was supposed to be out of town, I reminded myself. But there was no mistaking it. Someone was coming closer, the sound of footsteps growing louder as they approached the living room. Mark must have heard it too because his face changed. His eyes shifted to the door, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of panic in his expression. He stood abruptly, pacing, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to calm himself down. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, as if the air had turned thick and heavy. My heart pounded in my chest. Then, without warning, the door to the living room creaked open. And there, standing in the doorway, was my sister. But it wasn't her. At least, not the way I remembered her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and full of something I couldn't place as fear. Confusion? It was as if she had just stepped out of a nightmare, and I couldn't understand why. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mark's expression shifted again, this time with a mix of relief and something darker, as if he'd been waiting for her. As if he knew exactly what was about to happen next. The moment my sister stepped into the room, the air shifted again, this time, heavier. She looked at me, then at Mark, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on? Why are you both acting so strange?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. But it wasn't the tone I knew from her. She wasn't angry or curious. She was scared. Mark stood there, motionless for a moment, as if processing the unexpected turn of events. Then, slowly, he spoke, his voice low and almost too calm. "It's not what you think," he said, glancing between my sister and me, a strange tension hanging in his words. He stepped toward her, and that's when I saw it, the subtle way his hands trembled. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My sister's gaze flickered toward me, her face pale. "What's happening? Why are you acting like this?" she repeated, but there was more fear in her voice now, more urgency. That's when it hit me, the realization that something deeper was unfolding here. Mark wasn't just confused. He was hiding something, and my sister had no idea. I tried to speak, to warn her, but before I could, the door slammed shut behind her. My sister turned sharply, startled, and I saw Mark's eyes flash with something I couldn't understand. Panic? Regret? Whatever it wasn't good. He stepped forward, but just as quickly, the storm outside took a new turn. Lightning cracked so loudly, the house shook, and in that instant everything changed. In the chaos, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a second door opening. And then, a voice I hadn't heard in years, one that I'd long forgotten. "You should have known, wouldn't you?" I turned, and there she was, my sister. But this wasn't the sister I knew. I couldn't breathe as I stared at her. The woman in front of me wasn't my sister. Her eyes were cold, distant, and full of something darker than I could have ever imagined. It took me a moment to process the truth, to piece together the fragments of reality that had been slipping through my fingers all night. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just Mark being distant or frustrated with our family. No, this was something far more complicated. The woman who looked like my sister gave me a small, almost knowing smile. "You were never supposed to find out," she said, her voice chillingly calm. It wasn't my sister's voice, not anymore. She stepped further into the room, her movements smooth, deliberate. Mark didn't seem surprised. In fact, he looked almost relieved, as if the truth had finally been revealed. His eyes met mine, filled with guilt, regret, but also something else, a strange sort of resignation. I turned to him, my mind racing. "What is this? Who is she?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the woman who looked like my sister, as if she were the one in control. She was, in a way. The real question hit me like a punch in the gut. Had Mark known all along? Was this why he'd been acting so strange? Why he'd said what he did? "It's her," he muttered, barely audible. "She's been hiding in plain sight." The woman stepped closer, her smile widening. And now, everything changes. The storm outside raged on, but inside the house everything had fallen still. I was left standing there, facing a truth I couldn't fully comprehend, one that would haunt me long after I left.